Hi everyone. The remaining lectures for this term are going to kind of peel back the covers of the MVC framework and cover different pieces of functionality in a slightly bit more detail to get a better understanding of how can we manipulate and utilize the MVC framework as a whole to facilitate what we're trying to build. So this lecture today will be covering routes, and we'll be talking about what are routes, why are they important, what are different ways of utilizing the routing engine within the ASP.NET framework, and then what are the pros and cons of doing some of those things. So, basic question, what are routes? Well, routes are a means of directing traffic to a controller and action. So when you type into a URL a particular address of localhost / home / login, that URL is actually handled or captured by the routing engine and parsed and then directs to the correct controller and therefore action so that your code gets executed. And that's all driven off of these routes or URL addresses. So within your ASP.NET application, you have a file located under your project, under a folder called app start that's off the root of your project, and then inside of that file, or inside of that folder rather, is a file called routeconfig.cs. Now if you open up that file, what you'll find is something that's pretty simplistic, pretty straightforward. What it is it's basically one method call within a class, and this is the default route. This default route basically says anything that comes in, parse that URL using these conventions. So if you think about how you've been building your application so far and the types of URLs or website addresses that are getting generated, you'll notice that they kind of follow this convention of controller / action, and then if you're passing in an ID for say an edit or a delete, you'll see the /ID. So that is by design based on this route. So this is a default route, and basically it's kind of a catch-all route. Routing by its kind of nature is a very aggressive function within the framework. So what the routing engine will attempt to do is its best to take whatever URL that's typed in the website address bar and match it to a route. And whichever route it finds that matches that first, that is the route config or route map that it will take. So looking at this default route, you'll see that we have a URL of controller / action / ID. And then below that, we have what are defined as defaults. And we'll talk about the defaults in more detail later in this lecture, but the defaults here say that the controller default is home, the action default is index, and the ID parameter is an optional parameter. Now we've talked about a little bit of this in previous lectures, so this shouldn't be completely new to you, and based on what I've seen from many of your projects, you've gone in and manipulated this to facilitate the home screen of your application. So we're going to continue to kind of evolve this concept a little bit more. So looking at that route detail and route information, what does that mean? So if we look at this table, this actually comes from your textbook, so there's a reference there as well. We have the number of segments that are part of this URL, so this is mydomain.com. And because there are 0 segments or other factors or elements included, those default values take place. So controller is home and the action is index. So when you first visit your MVC application, your defaults are what are routed so that you get your home page. And then if you add one segment, which is the controller, then the routing engine will say, okay, so it's mydomain.com / customer. So the controller now is customer because the first segment of the route is the controller. So / customer means customer controller, but there's no action segment, so the index action will be used. Adding 2 segments of mydomain.com / customer / list says that the controller is still customer, but now the action to be called is the list action inside of the customer controller. And then if we go on and say mydomain.com / customer / list / all, there's too many segments here based on kind of the normal convention. So this actually will resolve in no route being found. So going through and defining your own routes is not it's not a complicated process, but there are different facets or ways of doing it. So we'll start off by talking about static segments. So a static segment is basically you going into a route config and adding a static element to specify some route conditions. Now, if you look at your existing project and you're looking inside that route config, one thing that you may notice, or more importantly, if you look at the area registration for an area, you'll notice that there's a route config in there and that there are static elements or segments within that route config. And there are two static segments that you'll probably notice. One in particular that you'll see almost every time is that there is a static segment that defines or correlates to the name of your area. And the reason for that is that when you try to access a particular area within your application, such as an admin area, for example, you'll be doing that by saying admin/controller name/action, and then that ends up routing to your area. So looking at the static pieces or static components, you'll notice that this sample shows basically two scenarios. The first scenario is that we are defining a static a static element in our route to say that our URL is public/controller/action with a default parameter of home and index. So our URL would basically be localhost/public/home/index, and that would take us to our home controller index action. So that's a kind of overly simplistic version. But let's say that we wanted to go through and actually have the shop portion of our application be at /shop/something. Well, maybe our controller for our shop is not called shop, but we want to treat it as if it was. So the second route below says if you go /shop/action and then it sets the default controller to home, then when you navigate to your website, you can say /shop/the action that exists inside of the home controller. And then that gives your users as well as search engines a different type of feel to your website. Another option is defining custom segment variables. Custom segment variables allow you to go in and say, here are the default values. And we've kind of talked about this previously, but these custom segment variables in this example to the right says, here's my controller, here's my action, and then I have a custom segment variable of ID. So by putting in curly brackets that ID, we are able to say the third segment of my URL will be an ID. Now, ID is the default, but we could add additional segments. And we access those by name. So in this case, this is what you would put inside of your controller. So just storing some variables in a view bag, we would say that the controller is home. Maybe we're calling this custom variable action. And then to actually capture the custom variable itself, we would say route data.values and then pass in the string of that custom route or that custom route variable. Likewise, we can define optional segments, and we kind of mentioned that just in this earlier section of this lecture, but there's a section of the map route function that says these are the defaults. These are the default values that should go into each one of my basically action variables or route variables. So the controller home, the action would be index, and then this says that the ID is an optional parameter. So if it doesn't exist when it goes to do the route checking, it says that's okay, it's optional, it's not required. So again, that idea of resolving optional segments, this is again the same kind of article or same kind of table, but if you look at segment 3, it says mydomain.com/customer/list/all. Now that would resolve to the customer controller, action list, and the ID of all. If we did 4 segments of customer/list/all/delete, that would be an invalid route because there's too many segments. To kind of overcome segment limitations and not having to define all the segments in detail, we can do what's called a catch-all. And the catch-all is notated with the asterisk and the word catch-all as the final parameter. So we don't have to define any defaults. That's pretty straightforward, but what we end up doing is we capture that catch-all using the route data.values and call for the catch-all parameter. And that catch-all parameter would then capture any of the trailing string segments in the URL. So looking down here at segment 5, you'll notice it says customer/list/all. So that maps to the customer controller, list action, ID of all, and then the catch-all captures the remaining delete/per. And by taking that, we can then consume that within our action, our function, and then use that data as needed. So the final concept that I want to cover is this idea of controller namespace hints. So you may be going, controller namespace hints. Okay. So the idea here is we have multiple controllers that live in our application that have the same name. Now, why would you end up having multiple controllers in your application with the same name, and why is that a problem? Well, if you were to use static elements, such as your areas, you could potentially have a home controller in that area, as well as a home controller in the root of your MVC application. Or, going to maybe a step further, you may be building an application where your controllers don't all live in your MVC app. So this allows you to do development of controllers outside of your MVC application, which gives you the capability of building plugin architectures. So if you have a third party or an outside developer that's building a controller and a set of actions, and that name has a potential collision, but it's for a particular segment of your program, you can actually tell MVC when you run across this route, let's say it's a static route, to direct that traffic to this namespace. So MVC will actually search through a particular namespace for a matching controller before it cascades onto a second route. So a sample of this would look like such. So we have a static element of home in our top route, and then we define the action variable and catch-all variable names. With the home static, we have the controller being defaulted to home, the action is indexed, and an optional ID parameter. But then after the default, we're defining an array of strings, and this array of strings says these are the namespaces that I want you to search or iterate over to find the home controller. So because our code would actually hit the home route at the very top first, it would first look for a home controller inside of URLs and routes.additional controllers. Comparing that to the second route, which is the traditional kind of catch-all route of take the first segment of the URL, the second segment, and the third segment, and attempt to map them to controller/action/ID, that will look for any controllers that match inside of the URLs and routes.controllers. So these are two different namespaces of the .additional controllers versus .controllers, and that this is basically a find and seek order that MVC will take on.